Uh, Good evening, everyone. Nitish got in touch with me asking me to speak at this public meeting because he said that I had written an interesting piece on the SIR. I think it's important to clarify that that piece was not about the SIR in the sense it was a standard explainer that the Caravan usually brings out before any election. But the trouble was when I was sitting to write that explainer, you cannot ignore the fact that this was an extraordinary election. Now, I became old enough to vote in 2008. This was the first election in my adult lifetime where questions about election integrity, whether the vote that everyone is going to cast is going to be counted fairly. This was the first election in my adult life where these questions overshadowed the campaign themselves. Now, it's not questions about the sanctity of elections in Modi's India are not new. Since he came to power, there's always been the narrative about EVMs being hacked, and I personally, and I think my colleagues at the Caravan, have generally been skeptical about that narrative because there's not really been that much hard evidence proving that there is some sort of manipulation happening at the EVM level. There are lots of troubling questions that remain unanswered, and in a sane democracy, we would be trying to get to the bottom of those questions. Like the stuff like 2 million EVMs suddenly went missing at some point. What happened to them? ECI has its own version of the answer, but it's never been a satisfactory answer. But there's never really been that sort of hard evidence that EVMs were being manipulated at scale. Another reason we've not really engaged with that EVM narrative was because we must admit, there is no denying that Modi is popular to a certain extent in this country, and just focusing on, and that the BJP has assembled a very formidable election winning machine. And so therefore, like if you from the beginning of of Modi's tenure, if you start focusing on EVMs, that kind of ignores some of the structural questions about how fascism is taking root in this country. And there are many good reasons why the BJP has been doing well in elections. They've really mastered the whole social engineering part of campaigning. And there are good reasons why the opposition has been losing elections. The collapse of the Congress is something that needs to be reckoned with in that scenario. However, it is my belief, and I'm sure a lot of people here share it, that no one can seriously argue that elections in India are free and fair. I mean, there is one person, one vote, and before this SIR, there really at least has been a focus on including voters rather than excluding them. However, there hasn't been a level playing field in elections for the last decade. Demonetization and the Election Commission's introduction of electoral bonds, they heavily skewed campaign finances. Parties which had traditionally relied on cash to fight elections suddenly had to do without cash. Meanwhile, corporate houses could contribute to the BJP with without even having to disclose that they had contributed. And of course, there's lots of cases of coercion by the state in order to get contributions to these electoral bonds. The Election Commission has a checkered past. This is another thing that should not be ignored. Like the pre-Modi Election Commission was an election commission that was coming out of a very dark history through reforms initiated by Session in the 90s. It was building credibility as an institution, but has a history of compromise with the ruling party. It is important also to remember that the Modi government's law, which changed how the Election Commission is selected, was not something that replaced a system where the opposition had a voice in the past. It was something that the Supreme Court had proposed as an alternative, which the Modi government rejected through its law. But the BJP has essentially made the Election Commission part of its formidable election machinery. And this is something the Caravan covered in detail in April 2024, just before the last general election. Whether it is scheduling elections, whether it is reacting, policing the sort of speech that political leaders are allowed to use while campaigning. Modi has made lots of hateful statements without facing any sort of censure. And in addition, the state machinery has been used to, again, essentially blackmail opposition leaders into having to defect in order to protect themselves from cases which may be true, which may be false. There's selective investigations by the state agencies. The Godi media essentially serves as a propaganda outlet for the ruling party. It has immense control over public debate about Modi. And again, the Caravan is bringing out its annual media issue this month, where we profile Rajdeep Sardesai and talk about how it's not even just your right-wing anchors who have been appropriated, even how nominally centrist anchors now have to act. And of course, there is always the structural critique of representational democracy, where in country after country, you essentially have one party of capital, one party trying to be the party of capital, and then a bunch of other outsiders who are trying to get in and then have to make various compromises and have constraints over what they can do in power. So it is not the case that elections in India have a level playing field. Now the SIR appears to be the next step in this mission of total domination for the BJP. It brings together aspects of two previous stratagems of the Modi government, the CAA, NRC, and demonetization. And I will get into why I think it bears some of these resemblances. But पहले chronology समझते हैं. Comrade Dipankar spoke to the media about the meeting that opposition leaders had with the Election Commission shortly before, I think when the SIR had just begun or shortly before that. And he said that opposition leaders were told that this SIR was being carried out in response to Rahul Gandhi's allegations of vote chori. I don't know if he had started using that phrase already, but basically he had pointed out a bunch of irregularities in the 2024 general election and the subsequent assembly elections in Haryana and Maharashtra. Now, these allegations concern manipulation of the voter rolls, and as subsequent press conferences he has spelled out how some of these manipulations were carried out. Now, unlike hacking EVMs, this is a very old way of rigging elections. I mean, as an example, if you look at the 1960 presidential election in the United States, it was said that whether John F. Kennedy could defeat Richard Nixon depended on how many dead voters Richard Daley could get to the polls in Chicago, because that there was massive manipulation of electoral rolls. It's something that political machines have generally done. There has been, again, before Rahul Gandhi's revelations, there has been circumstantial evidence. There have been discrepancies between what sort of between the vote tallies the Election Commission has issued at various times, and but these were very serious allegations. Now, what would an impartial Election Commission have done? What should they have done? You have serious allegations, you take cognizance of these allegations, and you conduct an inquiry. Instead, what did our ECI do? They immediately denied all the claims. They challenged Rahul Gandhi on procedural grounds. There is a certain way in which you must bring these concerns to the ECI, even though it is almost physically impossible to collect that sort of evidence within that time frame. But at the same time, it then introduced the SIR. Now, what does that mean? It's a contradiction in terms that on one ground you're saying, oh, our electoral rolls are pure, there is no manipulation, we have a very robust system that every year we update the electoral roll, we make sure there are no discrepancies. But now at the same time, now you're just saying, oh, we are going to do this, we're going to create the electoral rolls from scratch. And essentially, we're just cancelling out the last 20 years of special, of the annual revisions of the electoral roll. You're completely undermining that process by which you have generated these electoral rolls. Now, the next question was about timing of the SIR. The previous SIR in 2003 was conducted 2 years before the Bihar Assembly elections, the two Bihar Assembly elections of 2005 were held. This SIR was announced 5 months before the election was held. The entire process was announced. Now, also it was announced in the Bihar monsoon. Now, essentially what this is doing is, it's not giving any notice to the opposition in Bihar that now we have created a new round to our elections. That before you campaign to get voters to support you in the election, first you have to generate the electorate. You have to make sure that voters are registered to vote. Now, also, by announcing it so close to the election, Election Commission basically told its 87,000 booth level officers that you have 1 month to enroll all 1,200 people in your who vote in your booth. You have to make sure that they get enrolled, and that's basically 40. I mean, a booth has 1,200 voters, so it's basically 40 voters every day that you have to enroll. But that is a very difficult target to achieve, because the process of the SIR created these weird documentary hurdles that someone had to cross if they wanted to be registered as a voter. They produced a list of 11 documents that you needed to prove your date and place of birth, even though many of these documents do not prove your date and place of birth, even though negligible minorities of all of Bihar's electorate had access to these most of these documents. The only documents which had any sort of widespread access were caste certificates, which again only affects, which only one small section of the population will have, and the other is matriculation certificates, which again in Bihar less than 50% of the population had. Women were especially hit because women migrate at the time of marriage. Therefore, they have to prove their connection both here and there, and I believe the sex ratio of the electorate did come down overall in the state. Sagar, our staff writer, he reported on the SIR process as it was being carried out in July, and he followed a BLO one day. She was a BLO in a Brahmin neighborhood. Generally speaking, he found a very clear caste and class divide in who was aware of the process, who was not aware of the process, who had access to administrators who could help them through the process, who had there were people who had to travel hundreds of kilometers just to get themselves enrolled. Even in a Brahmin neighborhood where Sagar went with this BLO to this one household, it took 2 hours to get them to fill all the documents. There were two, there was a son and a daughter-in-law in there. There was in the house. There was a son and daughter-in-law who was outside the state, contacting them, so BLOs were working under immense constraints. They were struggling to get through 6-7 households in a day. Like, if you are honestly trying to make sure, again, remember, this entire exercise is to make sure 100% that the electoral roll that we are producing is completely solid. There is no manipulation in that. If you're going to do that, this 30 days was way too small an amount of time. So, but there was massive pressure from higher ups in the bureaucracy to get to meet this arbitrary target that the Election Commission had set itself. So they cut corners. There were lots of reports. Sagar met a volunteer at a booth who was doing some data entry work, and he said that what the BLOs, they were in a school, and what the BLOs were doing is they were getting a bunch of children from the school to just come and sign the forms. And the BLO was apparently saying, oh, ye Brahmin naam hai, yahan sign karo. Oh, ye Dalit naam hai, yahan angutha chhap karo. And as other journalists also found, this was being carried out at scale. There were thousands and thousands of forms which were being filled without any sort of process. Sagar's own parents did not know that they had been enrolled in the SIR. No one ever came to them and said and tried to register them, but their names were in the list. Another thing that happened is that BLO started being told कि आप आधार भी ले लो. At the same time that the ECI is fighting in the Supreme Court, saying that, oh no, Aadhaar cannot be used, the people who were carrying out the SIR for the ECI were going around accepting Aadhaar cards. Now, why was the ECI again fighting Aadhaar? The reason they gave in court, in the Supreme Court, where this matter is still being heard even though the election is over, they said we can't accept Aadhaar because Aadhaar is not a proof of citizenship. But nowhere in, like, why is the Election Commission so concerned about citizenship? Because this SIR is, in my opinion, and I'm sure of many others, this SIR is an NRC by stealth. The deadlines of 1987, 2003, that seem very arbitrary. Like, why is it 1987? Why is it 2003? These definitions were set in the Citizenship Amendment Act that the Vajpayee government passed in, I think, 2003. And which is why the 87 and 2003 deadlines make sense in that context. Because that CAA was passed in an attempt to carry out an NRC, which the Vajpayee government was unable to carry out before it was voted out. There was, when the Modi government tried to introduce an NRC, there was such widespread opposition. In the face of that widespread opposition, how is how is the Election Commission now authorized to carry out a de facto NRC without any sort of legislation, without any sort of even executive order by the government? This is, for all intents and purposes, like, on paper, this is an initiative that the Election Commission came up with on its own. Does the Election Commission have the right to adjudicate on people's citizenship? This is a question that is currently open in the Supreme Court case. Does the Election Commission have the power to issue rules of carrying out an exercise on this scale is also in dispute in the Supreme Court. Now, again, it comes down to what Amit Shah said when he said chronology samjhiye. The SIR follows the same logic as the CAA NRC. You create a documentary threshold that large sections of the population cannot meet. Hindu, Muslim, even I would venture to say upper caste, lower caste. Large sections of the population do not have the documents that the ECI is requiring. Now you create this documentary threshold that large sections cannot meet, but then you selectively police that threshold. you, as a state, you decide where you're going to enforce this threshold, where you're not going to enforce this threshold. This is again a very old tactic. As another example from the United States, after the Civil War, there was this entire period of white elites in southern states of the US reasserting control by disenfranchising the black population. They introduced sometimes bizarre exams that you had to give in order to be able to vote. Now, these literacy tests were tests that most white voters could not pass either. So they introduced something known as the grandfather clause. If your grandfather was a voter, then this literacy test does not apply to you. And what does that mean? No black people had grandparents who had been voters. They are disenfranchised. While white voters who cannot pass the same tests are still allowed to vote. For the CA, the Citizenship Amendment Act that the Modi government passed was supposed to be the grandfather clause for the NRC. You had a vast swaths of undocumented immigrants from neighboring countries who were not Muslim but who did not have the necessary documents to prove citizenship, who, if you're going to bring in a discriminatory, if you're going to bring in an NRC, they would be protected. This is essentially what Amit Shah told the Rajbanshis and other communities of West Bengal who were worried about the NRC. Here, with the SIR, the grandfather clause is the Election Commission's claims and objections process. Ultimately, in most constituencies, 90-95% of voters were eventually allowed to be registered. Their names finally appeared in the SIR. Does that mean that 90-95% of the voters had the necessary documents to prove their citizenship and their date and place of birth? No. Eventually, in any case, the Supreme Court finally agreed, insisted that no, you must accept Aadhaar. And basically, most of these people would, if there was an actual study of their enrollment forms, they would probably fail. But you see, possibly the highest disenfranchisement happens in the Simhanchal region, which is an important region for the BJP because it has historically done relatively well in that area because of communal polarization, where it has in recent years been carrying out a massive infiltrators narrative and has been, and again, like in any Muslim majority part of India, this sort of narrative the BJP has been playing, and this worked. This SIR was very convenient for this thing. By the calculations of the petitioners in the Supreme Court, I would estimate around 1.75 million Muslims were disenfranchised by this process. The Election Commission has disputed this figure because they're saying that the way you've calculated this, the petitioners used a software which looks at surnames and then compares that to a database to determine whether people are Hindu or Muslim. Election Commission has challenged that methodology, but it has not given any sort of demographic breakup of who got excluded. And this is a challenge that you really have to face, because even if you concede that the motives of this whole operation were perfect, that there is no manipulation happening, that this is a completely honest exercise, the communication of the Election Commission has not been clear. It has obfuscated data, it has obstructed reporters and politicians who have tried to. It took Rahul Gandhi nearly a year to find the revelations from whatever, this one small constituency in Karnataka, for instance. Now that this is being implemented on a nationwide scale at, again, a breakneck pace, who knows what extent this sort of disenfranchisement will take on a national scale. I'd like to get to the opposition response to the SIR, because not as a means to criticize the opposition, but to at least try to explain the sort of constraints that this sudden process placed on the opposition. The opposition was basically caught between two strategies, again, in my opinion. You either oppose this entire process, or you make sure your voters are registered. You make sure that at least your supporters get into the electoral rolls, and you devote like immense organizational structure, resources to ensure that. I think the opposition ended up choosing a middle path. They tried to turn it into a campaign issue. The voter Adhikar Yatra was, I'm sure, was successful in mobilizing people, but it might have diverted resources that could have been used to protect the right to vote for people. Because one crucial aspect of the SIR was that there were 87,000, sorry, is that a question? Sorry. There were 87,000 BLOs, but there were almost twice as many booth level agents from political parties who also could participate in enrolling voters. Now, one can only speculate that the NDA had advance knowledge that this was coming, had made their preparations. I personally don't have any evidence, but it's not very hard to put two and two together there. And they had a persistent advantage over the Mahagathbandhan when it came to BLAs. According to the ECI's data, in the beginning of the process, there were around 80,000 BLAs representing NDA parties, and there were around 55,000 BLAs representing the Mahagathbandhan. By the end of the process, there were 90,000 NDA and 65,000-ish Mahagathbandhan. Now, this is a 25,000, an advantage of 25,000 BLAs. According to the ECI rules, a BLA was allowed to enroll 50 new voters every day. That was an upper limit that was placed on the BLAs. Now, assuming all the BLAs fulfilled that mandate, made sure that, and assuming that the BLA prioritized people they knew who were voters for their parties, this advantage of 25,000 into 50 into 30 comes to 3.75 crore people. Like, the NDA mobilized resources to enroll 3.75 crore more voters than the Mahagathbandhan. Now, there were some calls that the opposition should maybe boycott the election. Looking at the results, maybe in retrospect that might have been a better idea. But there is the question of, did the SIR affect the election result? Newspapers have made their various hypotheses. The Hindu has said there is no significant correlation between the number of deletions in a constituency and the swing of votes from the Mahagathbandhan to the NDA. The R-square coefficient is basically says that around 3.75% of the swing can be explained through through like the deletions because of the SIR. Yes, sure. I would say some of that calculating that correlation might not be like may not be the most scientific way to determine whether or not the election was rigged, because in most constituencies you're talking about a relatively small percentage of the electorate that was disenfranchised by this process. Quint has found that the vast majority of seats that changed hands from the Mahagathbandhan to the NDA in this election, the vast majority, I think 60 out of 70 or something, some figure like that. In the vast majority of these constituencies, the number of deletions was more than the margin of victory. That is, again, it is a data point, but again, 202 seats for the NDA probably represent, inherently means that a lot of these seats that the NDA has gained have small majorities, small margins. So again, you can't really say for sure using these methods. Look, ultimately, if you look at Bihar's elections over the last 15 years, barring the 2014 and the 2019 general elections where there was a discernible Modi wave, if you look at all the other election results, there really hasn't been that much swing when you account for the realignments that have taken place. In 2020, the election result was very close, in large part because the Lok Janshakti Party and was fighting separately, and Upendra Kushwaha was fighting as part of the GDSF, and there was a slight amount of I was calculating just the swings in this election in 2015 as compared to the 2024 general election. The average swing in a constituency from the Mahagathbandhan to the NDA is 0.4% in this election. So a lot of this result can possibly be explained through the realignment, the fact that Chirag Paswan is back in the NDA, the fact that Upendra Kushwaha is back in the NDA, and but again, you can't really say that means that the SIR had no impact on the election. It was very possible that there was a 3% or a 5% swing from the NDA to the Mahagathbandhan in real terms, but this was cancelled out by the reshaping of the electorate, which you'd expect after the SIR skews slightly more towards the upper caste, and more prosperous parts of the state. And so, therefore, again, you cannot say for certain this election that SIR definitely or definitely did not play a role in this election. The real question though is, how are we in a situation as a mature democracy where we're trying to do advanced mathematics to figure out if our elections are fair or free and fair? This sort of situation where there is virtually no trust in the institutions that are meant to safeguard our democracy are a very large part of the crisis, of the democratic crisis that we find ourselves in at this point. And whether or not the SIR made an impact in the Bihar election, and I'm sure, and there are plenty of good reasons for why the BJP won, there are plenty of good reasons for why the opposition lost. So debating whether what sort of role this process play, beyond that you really have to think about where we are as a society, where we're going ahead with this sort of grand rewriting of the country's entire election rolls, where the Election Commission has the power to refer anybody to foreigners' tribunals, where there's a whole dystopian reality someone has to encounter just because they do not have the necessary documents to prove that they're a citizen of this country. And just in closing, when thinking about what you can do about it, yes, I think both strategies need to be followed to their logical conclusion. There has to be pressure, political pressure, protest pressure against carrying out this SIR on a nationwide scale that resurrects some of the soul of the anti-CAA protest movement. This whole thing needs to be fought in the courts, which several opposition politicians are doing. I'm not very optimistic of the Supreme Court ruling of what the Supreme Court will rule in this. There is also something to be said for how, say, the DMK is dealing with this in Tamil Nadu today, where they're devoting considerable resources to make sure that the right to vote is not being compromised at the grassroots. I believe the opposition needs to strategize, to come together to oppose this unconstitutional process that we're being dragged into against the popular will. So, thank you.